Fire away, introduce yourself, and share with us some of your thoughts about Create Streets and housing.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me this evening. As you know, my name is Boyd Smith. I'm the founder and director of Create Streets, which is a social enterprise which exists to make the case for what we would term conventional street-based cities of largely terraced houses and medium-rise flats in a conventional urban framework. And we do that for four key reasons. One, the data seems to be off the scale clear that is more popular. Two, that seems to be better correlated with well-being than nearly all available data. I'll come back to that in great detail. Three, actually done to sufficient breadth that would provide enough homes to solve the housing crisis. It's obviously not as easy as that. And finally, actually, the long-term economics, we're very confident based on historical data, are actually superior as long as you've got the right understanding of cost of capital and long-term flow. So that's why we exist. We do that in 4 or 5 key ways. One, by conducting or collating research into correlations in the built environment between built form and well-being and happiness and long-term economics. Two, by working with communities to take advantage of the new powers they have under neighbourhood planning to help them make the case for 95% of the time they want. Three, on a pay basis, because I'm not a magician, we can't just make things happen for free, by consulting to landowners, councils, investors, anyone who's got an interest in land and housing in the long term. It wouldn't work for a short-term developer, it's not the right model for us. And finally, we're starting to get involved with actual development, actually trying to put together the right combinations of community-led schemes backed by long-term capital. So our model is where a community wants to do something, can we help them get together with a provider of long-term capital to do what we believe is the right thing to do. We've so far worked or are working on consulting basis with 3 councils in London and with investors. We've in one case on their council's full estate generation programme, another case helping them get going on community consultation. We've done an analysis of estate regen community consultation for DCLG across London. We've run 40 or 50 year economic model on potential estate regen in South London. We've done urban design in a range of situations, mainly in London, not entirely. Nearly always, they're not quite always very community-led. We're working with a community, that's not quite always been the case. And as is publicly known, we're doing a lot of work at Mount Pleasant, where we're working with the Mount Pleasant Association on a community right to build order, which they will be bringing forward to Islington County shortly. So that's what we are. I'll start with a quote, if I may. A man called David Helper, who is the head of the Captain's Office Behavioural Unit, normally known as the Nudge Unit. He said in an interview a while ago that architecture and planning does not have an empirical, evidence-based tradition in the sense that science will understand. And we think that's both passionately true, or essentially true and passionately important. When you look at the data of what people want in the built environment, it's incredibly clear and consistent. You can always cavil this or cavil that, but the theme that comes through to us is incredibly clear. Just to quote a few data points, one, just because it was very recent, in a YouGov poll done last month, only 21% of people said they would want to go and buy a newly built, or I forget if it was buy or living, a newly built house, versus 47% who said they'd rather go for an old house. Now that's absurd. You looked at completely, apparently dispassionately. New houses are cheaper to run; they should be better. Everything about them should be better, and yet they're half as popular. In fact, in other polls, even less the case. There was a poll done for Rebra a little bit longer ago, which said that 2/3 of people would never even look at a newly built house as something to buy. In other polls, 0% of people said they wanted to move into a big tower block. That's a national poll. There was one done last year. Only 3% of people said they wanted to move into a block of flats where there were more than 10 units. You get slightly higher numbers in London-only polls, but it's always a minority. Most you normally see is up to 15-20% want to living in a big building, and we've never seen more than 22-23% wanting to live in a newly built house as their stated preference. So, look, on the face of it, quite extraordinary findings. Sal's did some work looking at the three things that are most important to people choosing a house. Neighbourhood, external appearance, and schools were the top three. We did a poll with Maury about 6 weeks ago, where we asked, do you support building on a brownfield site? 64% said yes. And then Maury showed individual homes and houses. It was all a similar type, so 2 to 3 storey street-based living. For the two most popular forms of housing, which were very much normal houses, the support for brownfield went up to 75 and 73%. For the least popular, which was an award-winning piece of architecture designed by someone who's recently been appointed to a very important and prestigious design panel, the support went down to, I think it was 23%, it's from memory, so 20-something certainly. And for the next one up, it was 34%. Those last two, between them, won 9 architectural awards. The top 2 won none. That's fine on it. Certainly the top one has won none. We think the second one has won none. So that's quite an important distinction in the level of support for brownfield housing in a house near us, or a house near where someone lives. Second point, really, is there's a disconnect, and Ross, I think you've looked at this data already, there's a disconnect between what design, planning and architecture professionals seem to want in the built environment, particularly architects, and most of the rest of us. We did a pop-up poll a couple of months ago. By pop-up poll, what I mean is we did it online. We sent it out to our 3,000 Twitter followers and about 1,500 email followers, invited them to do an online survey. So we don't claim that it is in and of itself representative, but its findings actually were pretty well aligned with polls that are, so we don't think it's massively out, but it could be out of it. It could be too southern and probably too prosperous in its response. But here's the thing, we showed 4 types of housing. I'm sorry, I haven't got pictures with me. I can send them to you afterwards. 2, if you like, one which was literally a pastiche of a Victorian street built in 1999. One was a modern take on the Georgian terrace of housing done by architect called Bugle and Smith. That got 87% preference, as we want that built near us. 2 other more innovative schemes, the one very innovative, one in what's called the New London vernacular, got 13% support. They're all photos tried to take roughly similar angles under reasonably similar weather conditions. But here's the killer: of that 13% who preferred the 2 more innovative types, nearly half were architects or planners. Of the other 87%, just over 20% were. So we did have a disproportionate number of architects and planners fitting it, but you saw a very clear divide in the response rate. That corroborates some fascinating research done by David Halpern, who I mentioned earlier, who was doing an experiment some years ago into how repeated exposure to the same image changes your perception of it. And he was doing it with students, because they're cheaper, and he was doing it with human faces and with buildings. And he was actually looking at how the effect of imagery changed things over time, but he found a fascinating sort of side finding. Architectural students and non-architectural students regard a face as equally beautiful in the same way, for apparently the same reasons. There's no subtle difference. When it came to buildings, there wasn't just a slight distinction, there was an absolute and total distinction. So the most popular building for the architectural student was the least popular for everyone else, and vice versa. And the longer they'd been architectural students, that was more the case. We were in a meeting, I won't say where, because I don't want to identify him, but a private meeting quite recently where the head of housing and regen was also giving evidence, and he referred to, his direct quotes, to dreary terraces and horrid Edwardian streets that most of us live on. Now this is a man who is making decisions, with a little control, but making decisions about housing provision and regeneration in here. Not here, but in an important part of London. So we think there is very clear data about what people want in the built environment. Beauty actually, turns out for most of us, is not subjective, it's objective. And there is an important disconnect between what many professionals, not all, choose to prefer and what arguably the rest of us prefer. Is this too much detail, or is this of interest? I can go this for ages. But, third point, actually, when it comes to less issues of design, but in terms of typology and built form, by that consistent preference for the house, and if in a flat in a building with fewer than 10 units in it or below a certain height, it's expressed different ways in different data points. That consistent preference, prejudice some would say, is actually deeply rational. In very nearly all of the data, not quite all, but in very nearly all of the data, when you've got controlled studies, i.e. ones that are peer-reviewed and are comparing socioeconomically similar groups of people. People living in houses, or people living in flats near the ground, or people living in flats and small buildings, seem to have better wellbeing outcomes, asked for and measured in different ways. I pulled up a couple of data points here, I won't read them all through, but a 1977 study of children, comparison of military families, US studies looking at children, Japanese studies, all find that kids seem to do better, mothers particularly suffer from less mental illness. It's a little hard to be too certain about the drivers, but I'd say there are probably 3 or 4 key ones. Control. There's good data that people get more stressed when they have a very efficient corridor type entrance to flats as opposed to much smaller entrances to flats, by which I mean a few number of front doors on the same core, because corridors are more efficient and more effective in terms of providing mass housing. 2, it's expensive to police those semi-private, semi-public areas that big buildings demand. There's good data, a lot of it quite historic, there's very good data that crime is much higher in those areas than anything else. There's a famous US study which found that crime was 604% higher in the semi-private areas of big buildings as opposed to the equivalent of much smaller buildings. That data doesn't come through as clearly, in fact, it doesn't come through at all, for big buildings with more prosperous groups of people living in them. And that's because the service charges there can afford to pay for a concierge and CCTV, and you get sociologically different types of crime conducted. And then finally, children, where there's been consistent data that children living in very big buildings or flats a long way from the ground tend to do less well, have more behavioural problems, have less access to usable private outdoor space. I think it's worth saying straight up front, quite a lot of the data is quite old, because there was a lot of research done in this in the 70s into the 80s. It then tailed off. There is some recent research done in Vancouver, which is not perfect research, because it doesn't properly correct, I don't think, we haven't properly looked through it yet, we don't think it properly corrects for differing social groups, but we certainly, on the face of it, so it comes with a caveat, shows the same themes emerging of people in big buildings knowing fewer of their neighbours, tending to behave less well to them, having less social interactions so they feel they can control the way they choose to have. There was a lovely piece of research done in the US about 20 years ago on students, so this is a control group, where in big buildings and small buildings and high from the ground and sort of near the ground, they left wallets, requested charitable donations, and left stamp address envelopes lying around, and found an inverse relationship between the size of the building and the height at which people live from the ground and their propensity to return the wallet, post the stamp address envelope, or make a charitable donation. So it's quite a rational, that inbuilt prejudice, if you like, that many of us seem to feel for a more modest dwelling in a well-connected street seems to be quite rational. So there are other data we could get into, which I'm not proposing to now, particularly because it's like better known territory about connectivity and how better connected streets tend to be worth more. Traditional block structures have less crime. There's some good recent research on that by space syntax. Essentially, if you've got a block with all the outdoors doors facing outward and the block inwards, that's a better crime outcome. So that's some of the data that underlies some of our work. I was going to talk for a couple more minutes, if that's okay, just on estate regeneration. Would that be of interest? So we believe, we're certain in numbers, estate regeneration is a very material opportunity for solving urban housing crisis. But I think it's worth saying 2 points quickly up front. One, it's very clear in the data that estate regeneration is a stressful thing. Things that happen to your housing and where you live that you're not in control of are very stressful. It's not just self-evidently true, it's proven. And I think anyone who talks about estate regeneration and is promulgating it and suggesting it needs to accept that right up front, which I hope we do. Secondly, although there are some good case studies, and come back to a couple, there have also been some absolute horrors in the last 10 to 20 years, both in terms of the process, the way people have been treated, the social outcome in terms of non-replaceable social housing, and indeed the physical outcome as well. So again, arguing for estate regeneration doesn't mean you are defending every estate regeneration that's happened, and we certainly passionately would not. In fact, we actively criticise many of them. Clearly here in Barnet, Green Park, West Hendon, Stone Road, Doris Valley, no doubt there are others, things are happening, no doubt more will happen. We did a piece of work with Savills for the Cabinet Office last year, which has not been published, so I can't actually use the numbers from it. But I'm so conscious I'm on camera. But nevertheless, I'm going to hint to where the conclusions led to. We did one of our first pieces of work was trying to do some top-down numbers on how many years housing supply state regeneration would provide. And our first piece of work estimated it was mid-range, about 10 years supply. That was a very material underestimate. As we did the work in more detail and could check it more profoundly than we were able to do to start with, that's where I'm not going to give you a number, but it was a very material underestimate. Secondly, particularly if you're looking at it through the right economic prism of long-term value. And one point I forgot to mention earlier, but which Ross's housing professor will know very well, bigger buildings don't last as long and their costs go up more over time. It's harder to retrofit them, technology gets worn out. What was state-of-the-art heating in 1970 is very much not state-of-the-art heating. Actually, by 1980, let alone by 2015, they just cost more to run and take longer to run. But particularly when you're looking at that prism, frankly, even when you're looking through a more short-term prism, maximising density is not the right way to maximise value. In the work that we did, we urban designed 6 actual states. As an academic exercise from zone 1 out to zone 6. The people we were working with did a best guess estimate as to what would get planning permission. We'll come to some of the rules shortly, but that tended to be bigger blocks with more open space between them, whereas we did a very traditional London streetscape of terraced houses and medium-rise flats. Ours was slightly lower density, but was worth more. I mean, it was just worth more, even though it was low density. And that doesn't necessarily just turn into straight developer's profit. That's developer's profit that you could take as profit, or you can recycle into more social housing. You can make a legitimate political decision about them. We keep out of where that decision should be. We just say, you've got more value inherent there to make legitimate political trade-offs with. We've involved 7 tests for estate regeneration. Does it have local resident support? Does it have local neighbour support? Does it increase the total amount of housing? Is the amount of social housing, I say social / affordable, I'm deliberately being comprehensive on that, is it at least equal? And we're not saying it should necessarily be more, because there are some sites where we'd argue it doesn't need to be more on that specific site. The bigger sites, I think you can take up the total volume. Typically you can take up the volume by between 30 to 60% and have a traditional London street structure, a little bit supercharged, but very much a traditional London street structure. Going beyond that, which we typically are doing these days, it gets harder to do that. Is the spatial, so this is the 5th test, is the spatial layout better? Does it plug in better to the streets around it? Are the internal standards good enough? And note again, I don't necessarily say better. Some of the internal standards, as you well know from the 60s, were way better actually than what we have now. And I have to say, that didn't in and of themselves make them a success. So it's not just internal space standards. And is it a mixed community that is being provisioned both in tenure and use? And again, please note one of the tests which isn't there is the more green space. Often, I'm happy to put a head above parapet here, often the amount of green space should be reduced. Too much green space costs money to run, and it's of the wrong type. Green space that is something, communal, public but contained and well overlooked, private, actually is better valued, performs more social function. This is very clear evidence. Central Park, to take an obvious example, is great for the New Yorkers who walk through it every day. Most New Yorkers, it's a complete waste of time. The little green spaces that you pass or you have regular access to actually perform more social good on the people who use them. We've also, we'll stop soon, I promise. I'm probably going for too long. The way to get estate regeneration right, and this is trying to get practical and helpful hopefully for you. The first is long-term land ownership. Councils, RSLs and their partners need to be in it for the long term. The people who build it either need to be the same people who are going to own it forever, or thinking they're going to own it forever, or they're contractors who are just coming in to be paid an honest day's work to do an honest bit of work. You should not ever be, doing an estate regeneration with someone whose view on capital, the returns they're trying to get is a 5, 7 or less than 10-year framework. I say ever, maybe there are exceptions, but the absolute starting rule should be align the interests of the people who are coming in to help the council RSL do it and them, and that should be for the long term. Because if you understand value in the long term, you don't necessarily quite maximise density, but you build something that people will love and appreciate and that is beautiful. We've been looking at the Halifax data series over the last 30 years. It tells you actually blindingly obvious, which is that historic areas have gone up in value in London by twice as much as non-historic areas. And that's not properly controlled for connectivity, but some work done by Savills, which does control for that, shows you exactly the same. If you build a conventional street structure of terrace houses and flats, it's worth more. So, I mean, but over time, that value of place fructifies as people grow to love it, shops grow up, communities. As an adjunct to that, this is a broader point than just estate regen, and we were talking about this earlier. The simple thing to do on viability tests, which are outrageous, is to make them transparent. If the viability test is public, I think developers and councils will be a lot less comfortable with some of the stuff that's going on. A good developer, I'm not going to say this for obvious reasons in a moment, a good developer who is a good guy, I believe, was very transparent with us a few months ago, where he said quite clearly, look, I can make the viability test say one thing for the council, and they're idiots, they'll believe it, it wasn't for this council, and my private economics say something completely different. And at one level, that shouldn't be surprising, because if you're modelling the future, guess what, everyone's making it up. And quite legitimately, there are going to be variables in there you can't know, and put them out over 20 years, and they do genuinely make a big difference to value, and that is a legitimate, we just can't know the future. But when you put in a little bit of self-interest, and maybe a bit more than a little bit of self-interest, you just get to very divergent numbers quite easily, and even too easily. It's got to be made transparent so people can challenge assumptions that are outside the reasonable ambit. So third point, I'll put this punctually, I'll try to put it punctually. It's not about consultation. Consultation is the wrong word. Consultation means we've got our plan, what do you think about it? Consultation too easily means we've got these blocks and this open space which fits the rules. Do you want this block to be that high and this block to be that high, or would you like this one to be this high and this one to be that high? It's too easy, and I've seen this, it is too easy for estate tenants and leaseholders not to realise what is actually possible. There was a estate we were doing some work on earlier this year, when I asked the tenants, this is the end of the process, what's your favourite part of London? And the answer they gave, it was like a sort of an emotional fountain that came out of their love for the East End terraced housing that had been there until 1970-something. Now, actually, they couldn't have had that back. It's a 2-hectare site, but they could have had a supercharged version of that back. It just wasn't offered to them. The architect, who was a good guy, and the housing association was a good, they weren't an ill-intentioned housing association, but they had designed a scheme which had some green fingers, had some open space for a bit of water. And when I asked the tenants and the leaseholders, would you have swapped that for a more traditional street structure? You'd have had to lose some green space and make it smaller and a bit more private, and you'd have to lose some of that open space for water. The answer is a direct quote from the chairman of the Tenants Association, who was not opposed to the development and had been well treated. A direct response was yes, yes, yes. So it isn't about consultation, it's about co-design. It's about bringing in people who live there and some people who live around, and doing a full inquiry about design, actually getting their input, their wisdom, their knowledge right at the start of the process. And many developers, I guess nearly all developers, and frankly many architects, not all architects, are absolutely terrified of that and do not like it. And it is hard, to be fair, to fit in with the standard procedures of planning approval and processes that are the industry norm. But we argue, well, certainly passionately, we hope convincingly, that if you bring real people into the process properly at the beginning, some consultations just don't ask the right questions. Some are malicious fakes. We saw one the other day which said, do you want more roads and traffic? Because the developer was kind of pushing in a certain direction. Next point, just coming on from that, I promise I'm nearly finished. Design codes. Allowing people who live there or who will live there or live nearby to start getting into the design of what an estate will be, setting some of the parameters, materials, spacing of windows, heights. Obviously there's got to be economic constraints there. And actually setting some of those parameters in a way that actually was done 200 years ago or 100 years ago by the Metropolitan Building Acts or by some of the 18th century acts. So some of those parameters are set, and then the community can step back and let architects or builders do things within that, and you get variety, you get scope, and you get the complexity. But that's a way to actually get, at a sort of meta level, the community setting what the place will look like and how it will connect. And then finally allowing, and this will be perhaps a bit more controversial, but when you've got strong community sign-off for estate regen, and when they want this, we would say permitting some loosening around some of the rules in the London plan or some of the borough codes. It's just a fact that there are a range of rules in the London plan, in some of the housing and building statutes, and in some of the, I don't know about Barnet, but certainly so many of the borough rules in London, that make it harder to build the types of high-density, efficient, perennially popular traditional streetscape that provably most people prefer. When we came up with our proposal for Mount Pleasant, which in the first poll got 99% support of 258 local residents polled, the response of one very experienced, and I know that correct, developer was, very beautiful, you'll never get it through planning. the response of the local resident was the whole of London would fight for Mount Pleasant Circus. Now we're now doing more work, and we think we will be able to get it through planning, but we're having to make some quite material trade-offs. There are rules on lifetime homes rules on access that make terraced houses less internally efficient and tend to make them wider. That means you build fewer homes, more likely to build flats, people prefer to be in homes. I was looking at some newly built houses the other day, actually last month actually, which are 7.5 metres or 7.9 metres wide. They have the same gross internal area as an 1825 house, which is 5.5 metres wide. We've got thinner staircases, higher staircases, non-level access. Our point isn't that all houses shouldn't have, greater access, people are older or disabled people. Some absolutely should, but should it be all of them? And if the local community says, actually, we're getting more people in houses, is to allow some flexibility, so it's just not 100%. Isn't that the right trade-off? Life's about trade-offs between goods and bads. And at the moment, we've gone absolutely to one extreme, and the consequence is we are building fewer houses in London than we otherwise would. There's no doubt about that. And we've got quotes, which I won't bother reading out to you, but from architects and people who do this. Just similarly, borough rules on light and street width make it very hard to build medium-rise conventional London streets. Most Edwardian mansion blocks, which are definitely popular, you just couldn't build them today because they make a trade-off. You get lots of light at the front, you get less light at the back. Okay, that's not going to be right for everyone all the time, but it's not an unreasonable trade-off. It's just not one you can make today. Also, rules of the London Plan on green space put enormous pressure on maintaining open green space. That's in many times a good thing, but it's not always a good thing. There are times when you need less open space and turn it into private space or communal space, or a square or a communal garden. And I think our point would be, when the community backs it in state regeneration, allow some of those trade-offs to happen, because right now it's very hard to make them happen. I've gone for far too long, I'm sorry, but there you go. There's some thoughts on what some of the data says and what we think is the right way to do estate regeneration.
Thank you. Before we take questions, if our chair is now right, would like to come to the front.
I think you should carry on.
No, you come up and then you can...
questions, Nick.
I hadn't realised actually what people have come into the room since.
Nikki's been here for quite a while. Just here.
So for those...
Thank you.
Those of you who were not there at the beginning, this is Nikki Gavron, Assembly member who is the chair of the Housing Commission.
I'm sorry, very sorry.
Planning, isn't it?
The chair of the Housing.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Chair of this
I'm chair of, I'm chair of the
planning committees.
Are you planning, you're still planning?
Yeah, I'm chair of the London Assembly's Planning Committee, and I was formerly Deputy Mayor leading on the London Plan, and I've got quite a lot of experience in housing and planning policy. So, that's the... I know Nick is amazing.
10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, so we've got 10 minutes for questions. I think it might be quite good to... Oh, we'll see. Us first, but let's see if any of the floor want to ask a question.
Well, thank you. I thought very interesting. One of the things that I think talking about earlier is that we've had a lot of evidence, and anyone who's a Barnet councillor will know that actually I think we have done regeneration badly in terms of bringing a community along with us. And it's quite interesting to hear what you're saying about how you would do regeneration differently. I've got a number of questions. One of the questions is actually, do you find looking at some of the material you have, a lot of it is quite, what I'd say, kind of classic urban, in terms of getting the density right, we're talking about quite moderate but reasonably high-rise street properties to get similar density to high-rise with lots of open space between. How appropriate do you think that is for a suburban London context as opposed to an inner London context? Because I certainly aware of cities like Edinburgh, for example, where you do get that, and Paris, where you do get that quite high density street properties. And places like Arnold Circus and near the East End, where it's quite, do you have any sort of comments on how you would make that work? And I'm just thinking of the estate quite near here, West Hendon, where we've got very large tower blocks very near the Welsh Harp, and the smaller units behind. So the view is blocked for a start of the Welsh Harp if you're living in the all the social units are behind, so it's not a particularly integrated scheme at all in terms of mixed communities. And I think, you know, it is, while there are some bits about the layout that they've attempted to create better streetscape, a lot of it is quite unpopular. That's the feedback I get with residents. The design is not, a lot of the residents are very unhappy with the design. So would there have been a way, for example, taking West End, that you think, or maybe you don't want to take a specific case, that you can create something that is appropriate for an outer London landscape?
I won't talk about it specifically. But so conceptually, taking that example, sort of conceptually, as we all know, the population of London is going up, the percentage of young people is going up. It must be possible, I'm not saying it all can be programmed, but it must be possible in the better connected bits of the suburbs to say we can create a more conventionally urban, central urban, near inner suburb rather than outer suburb urban form, particularly where that connects seamlessly and, if you like, steps down to the more traditionally Edwardian or whatever it is suburban streets around. So I think that is possible, and you certainly can very easily, with no high rise, not even any big blocks, get to densities of 210 to 250 units per hectare without breaking a sweat. And that's the density of much of Kensington and Chelsea, and no one could call that high rise.
How many floors are you talking about?
That would be between 4 to 7, it would be a mix. And by the way, that includes houses, obviously you've got lots of flats in there as well at that density. High density terraced housing can slightly, depending on all sorts of factors and what you counted in and so on, can easily get to about 75 to 90, some say up to 100, I think that's pushing a bit. And then the more flats you put in and the more extra floors, scales up. Pimlico's about 175, 180, Notting Hill a bit more, and as you get up into the north bits of Kensington, it goes up a bit higher. Just to give one example, Earl's Court's a bit higher still. So that, I think, is doable. Now, again, in terms of how to get the design right, which we think is actually very important, because it really, as we hopefully showed on our polling, it really does influence people's response to a place. It isn't often the thing that, in our experience, that estate residents mention first. In our experience, and I suspect in yours, quite recently, typically the first things that get talked about when you do if you like, an open question, what worries you, it's about maintenance, so antisocial behaviour, right to return. It's concerns about the process, and it's concerns about current conditions, quite reasonably. And I think the reason we would argue so strongly for co-design is to help people think through ways to give them control. We know that's correlated with better mental well-being and finding it less stressful. So we genuinely put them in, not in control, but put them at that top, genuinely at the top table right at the start, accepting there has to be trade-offs, it's not going to be, and link that through to how things look like, and actually, at least in part, democratise that process. We are, what was it? I think it was Peter Mandelson, I'm being playful with the Labour Committee. I think it was Peter Mandelson who got into trouble years ago for saying that the age of representative democracy was dead and that participatory democracy was coming, but he was absolutely right. People, due to technology, changing social expectations, will expect to have more influence on what happens in the built environment than they would have accepted 60, 70 years ago. That it is true, there's no doubt about it. And I don't think the planning system has caught up with that. And when you have these measurable disconnects between what some built environment professionals and the rest of us think and want in the built environment, and frankly, very differing levels of appreciation put to visual innovation, as opposed to small c, comforting designs. Well, as I put it to an architect the other day, if the price of popular consent for solving housing crisis is a few sash windows, who cares? It doesn't mean they have to function like an 18th century sash window, but if people want something like that, let them, as long as it functions and can work economically, let it happen. Put them in control with the designer, with the investor, with the planners right at the start. Go into a room, shut the door, have some pencils, have some paper, have the parameters that have to be there, because there will be parameters, there's a certain density you have to get to, and I put flippantly, don't come out until you've done it together. Sorry, a long answer.
Yeah, no, I thought that. Obviously, like for like is something that we certainly feel quite strongly about. That if you're doing regeneration, you've got to provide like for like. Now, there is a bit of debate about how much. Mount Pleasant's not a good example, a controversial example in terms of the affordable percentage, and that's because of the mayor's intervention. But aside from that, 'cause this is about design, not. But in your view, you do not think there's a reason that you would that given if a longer time frame is used in terms of payback, which seems to be the important thing, you do not think there should be an impact on the percentage of affordable that you can obtain in a scheme? Doing it.
Clearly, there is a relationship ultimately between density and the amount of affordability you can put there, because you can't disconnect those. And we haven't run and don't pretend to have run numbers on every single estate we get in London, so I can't give you an absolutely comprehensive never answer. But based on our modelling and based on modelling we're aware of that we haven't done, but which we've seen, particularly when you've got a long-term perception of value and are building a mixed community, so you are selling stuff and you have got PRS in there and you've got some commercial as well. We haven't seen an example, I mean, we ourselves have been involved in quite a few now, where it's obviously site specific, but taking the density up, I'll say 50%, less in some, more in others, requires, in any case, reduction in social housing on the current terms and conditions. We haven't tried to model complicated things and taking it up and changing it. We haven't deliberately got into that, but we believe, based on the numbers we've seen, and I should say that isn't necessary, and I'd add one, perhaps repeating myself, important point. Clearly, once you've got someone coming in there saying, I want to get my value out in the next X years, and my profit margin shall be 20%, it's not really their fault that they're able to say that, then other things may apply.
Yeah,
but,
no, I agree with everything you said about viability and the short termism of development, and I could see, when you look at some of the best schemes, they've taken a long time. Central Edinburgh took a long time to build. It was done on a plan, but that's maybe a very old-fashioned, obviously. But actually, there's a degree in which payback is demanded by developers very quickly.
The level of payback and the timing of payback is absolutely crucial. And this is why we come to the point, and I'm not sure about maybe Keith was in when I said this, but working with RSLs who properly understand the value of their stock and the changing maintenance costs of that over time. Some do, some probably do less well. And working with investors who are looking at an annuity income stream, or perpetuity frankly, who want to, some extent, match the model of the growth in Orchid estates. Let's say a beautiful bit of town, it's a mixed community working and living there, and let's just draw our income out of it over many years, and if we need to sell a bit to get a value uplift, we can do that.
Right, well,
sorry.
This is 10 minutes, but
I go off too long.
You've got to be very, very brief.
Sorry.
My predictions have been like
Sorry.
I'm concerned about who makes the decisions. And you mentioned about local communities, etc. And in your paper you talk about this Charlotte scheme where you have local participation. But all the people mentioned in these reports are people who are already involved with the project. What it doesn't seem to cover is aspiring people who want to come into it. I'll make you an example. My society was involved with an eco towns with a flavour of the month. We got involved with what we call for a derelict farm near Leicester. Leicester City Council, Labour control, wasn't very keen. Market Harbour and the other one, his name was rather Conservatives weren't keen. So there was no need for housing. No problem. In fact, there were 10,000 people on the City of Leicester's waiting list and 6,000 on the other local authority. Didn't seem to bear anything at all. So the problem was that the whole thing was decided by NIMBYs. The people in Market Harbour, particularly in the rural areas, didn't want to have this, all the oaks moving into our farming area. And I think this is a danger you have to address that. So you've got to not only cover the people who are already there, but people who want to come and live there, who may be dispersed throughout the city. And I don't see any mechanism in your paper, it doesn't mean to say it isn't there. There is no mechanism to ensure that future residents needs will not be taken into account, and that it could be, if we weren't careful, a vehicle for the NIMBYs to make sure nobody that they didn't approve of moved in.
Very, very good point. I'll answer it quickly, and if it's not sufficient, I'll let you come back to it as you wish. So I think very fair point. Clearly it is more difficult to be represented by people who haven't yet moved in. Practically it is harder to do. I think actually a very sensible one for you to make, or for a council to decide as policies, that if you were to be running a charrette or inquiry by design with people who live on the estate or nearby, would in some way maybe you'd find maybe someone from Shelter, or maybe someone represent. I think an innovative way to try and solve that and get someone represented around those tables who in some way can be legitimately said to represent that interest, I think is very, very sensible.
Well, they could be the elected representatives of the local authority. They represent the people, surely. I'm not a
Yes, I think in estate regeneration specifically, a council also is the landowner. So I mean, I'm not in any way decrying your right to be the elected representative, because you are, but I think... Sorry,
not in local government.
Sorry. Just very quick, just on the countryside NIMBY point, I think in London it's an easier problem than it is in rural areas, which is actually most people in London are prepared to say we need more housing. So I think that absolute, no, we don't want our fields built on, and never, 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 it's a slightly easier problem to solve in London than it is further out. But actually, again, the data is quite interesting. But actually, when you present people with a certain type of design and a certain type of form, and they feel they've been involved with it, again, you can turn NIMBYs round. But it is harder, I can see that. And just very funny, in terms of democracy, and I think another very good point, that people who come into an inquiry about design are involved working with architects and investors, clearly they've got to be physically and sociologically representative in terms of where they come from and range of communities. There's actually quite a good mechanism for doing that already, which is setting up a neighbourhood forum. So I know you may have seen in the bill that we have helped put into the House of Lords, we've suggested very much using some of the mechanisms of planning and neighbourhood forums to ensure exactly that, because clearly you can't be taken over by this community or that community, or people who live there or people who live there, so that does need to be ensured. And if you...
Okay. I hear what you're saying.
We could ask more questions, but I mean, prompted that we've got others to fit in with us. I think we can come back to you.
I have a very quick question, if you don't mind. I mean, I've worked in housing management. I managed some of those for quite a long time, those lovely properties in Pimlico. When I worked at the Crown Estate, that were very popular, and we were affordable housing. One of the problems is, with those old designs, is actually, I mean, because one of the things you're saying is trade-off, in terms of, which I understand, trade-off about what people want, and to get the density that a bigger, blocks of flats would give you, there's a little bit of a trade-off in terms of design. But one of the problems is actually getting things like prams and top floors on a street property, a street property. And prams are a big nightmare, cycles are another thing. Are there ways around that? Because I noticed you mentioned some of the relaxing some of the cycle standards, but actually it is an issue. If we're going to have a greener city, we do have to encourage people to use bikes. Is that something that you've been able to address in terms of that type of street property? And having flats on the top floor up 3 flights with what you're talking about, narrower corridors, and getting a pram up to the top is, I mean, what would your...
I think the challenge is very fair. And this may sound like a compliment.
Not having them in communal areas where
it is a matter of trade-offs.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons why, and this ain't going to work in Pimlico, but I would imagine it would be more doable here, would be that we'd argue that get as many families as you can into houses is precisely to avoid that point. So the pressures you've got to someone like Pimlico, where land is incredibly valuable, and where getting actually a non-level access in terms of the extra building it's getting you is actually quite impactful financially, I suspect will be less the case here. So a level access, terrace housing, I think that's the best answer to that. But under London plan it won't be possible because the changes coming through now will require lifts from first floor access upwards. That's clearly right for people with access issues or perhaps with prams, but it doesn't mean it's right for a block of flats or a medium-rise flat where most people there are in their 20s or early 30s and then perfectly fit young adults. And there must be space to have both, and that would be, on my point, would need to be trade. For bicycle storage, surely the answer is to do what we used to do with cars, which is to put them on roads and set up racks on the streets. So why they all have to be inside a property, because there's that, I can't forget what they're called, but that secured way of storing bikes on roads, and as the number of cars is starting to go down, and younger people are getting to London, taking the test later, and own fewer cars than their predecessors did 30 years ago. I think we just keep pushing in that direction. Bikes don't have to be stored in your building. Sometimes they can, sometimes they should. And bigger buildings it's easy to do. Small buildings it's harder to have that specified place.
I'd like to ask you questions about space standards, but I'm going to not. Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And if you said you'd send this presentation take.
Yes, I will.
Notes, that would be great.
And we
You
can
always
follow
ask
up
the
with some questions, can we?
No, absolutely. I'll do my best to have an answer.
I have several that I'd like to ask.
Do so.
Yes.